Hello and welcome to Business Africa with me, Ronald Kato. This week, the EU-Africa Summit draws to a close in Brussels with promises to reshape ties and bolster development, trade and economic cooperation. But will action match ambition? Plus, Ethiopia and Kenya sign a power trade agreement as Addis Ababa prepares to switch on its mega dam on the River Nile. The energy giant is also eyeing electricity exports to South Sudan and Somalia. Stay with us for the details. Thank you for joining us. Previous EU-Africa summits have resulted in many action plans and strategic declarations. It's been 22 years since the first summit was held in Cairo, but little in the bilateral ties have changed for the better. There's a huge imbalance in the EU-Africa trade and economic underdevelopment in Africa. So is a new dawn in the EU-Africa ties on the horizon?
The 6th EU-Africa Summit began and ended with a promise to reset ties between the two continents and to create a more equal and mutually beneficial relationship. Smiling faces, firm handshakes and eloquent speeches, but Africa and Europe have been there before, and we'll be hoping the energy doesn't fade in the weeks and months after the summit. The 150 billion euros investment plan unveiled by the EU chief and the pledge to support vaccine manufacturing in Africa have received applause. But the vaccines come nearly 2 years late and after a lot of goodwill eroded. But the size and scale of action both parties take to make bilateral trade bigger and fairer will be a factor that will fundamentally reshape ties beyond just speeches. European countries have imported cheap raw materials from Africa and exported to the high-value manufactured products, resulting in trade imbalances and perpetual economic underdevelopment in Africa. The African Continental Free Trade Area marked its first anniversary in January. African leaders have highlighted how the trade bloc can benefit both EU and AU member states. It's been 22 years since the first EU-Africa Summit. Will this be the time things change for the better?
My guest is San Bilal. He's an EU-Africa expert at the European Centre for Development Policy Management. Thank you so much, sir, for your time. The EU-Africa relationship has mostly been a donor-recipient one. And it's not the first time we're hearing such buzzwords as New Deal or an equal partnership. But how much do you think is going to change with this summit?
Well, I think there's a genuine will from the European side to have a more equal partnership and to try to get a new impulse to that partnership. And I think, with the European Commission being perhaps more strategic and realizing their interest also in Africa and more globally, and with the French presidency, I think Emmanuel Macron has been very vocal about the need to work more with African institutions for common goods, also on the international scene. So I think there's a will to change. Having said that, of course, in practice, it's a different issue, and I think it will take time to see a lot of the changes to fundamentally change. First, Europe is very complex itself, so it's so difficult for Europe to get into a common position. But by the time they get a common position, and they go to Africa, then they have already advanced quite a lot. And from the African side, it's also quite difficult to get a common position and to articulate clearly what they expect. But we see progress, and I think in the areas of vaccines, for instance, and the response to the pandemic, we've seen perhaps a more mature type of relationship.
Speaking of vaccines, San, there was a lot of emphasis at the summit about making them available in Africa. But what do you think is the best approach? Is it technology transfer or donations, as is the case now?
First, that they are coming together to try to see how they could address jointly, and in particular, the manufacturing of vaccines and medical products. And how they could help strengthen the African architecture and the drawing on the European lessons, sharing lessons. But also Africa has a lot of experience on pandemics. So they also have a lot to to help and teach Europe. So in that sense, there's a common approach. The other element is perhaps there are also differences on the way and dissatisfactions on some of the relationship around intellectual property rights or some lack of vaccine access for Africa and thinking that Europe has not done enough. And the Africans have been vocal about that.
Some EU countries have mostly imported raw materials from Africa and exported back high-grade manufactured goods. Do you sense from this summit that there is a concrete plan to turn this around, to change it?
I think what is interesting in the approach that Europe and Africa are taking together is this greater emphasis on value addition and on how Africa could industrialize more rapidly, also through a green transition and digitalization. And so, there's really a focus on having global value chains and regional value chains, greater participation for Africa and African economies. And that is in the context, of course, of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, but also in the context of the relationship with Europe. So I think there's a possibility of really win-win with attracting private investments on these value chain endeavors.
San Bilal, nice to have you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Now, when the EU was not responding or slow to respond, Africa, hungry for development finance and infrastructure, courted other partners, China in particular. Beijing has become Africa's largest bilateral lender, a major investor and financier of infrastructure in the last 2 decades. And Brussels is desperate to recover lost ground. Hannah Ryder is an economist and the CEO of Development Reimagined. Thank you so much, ma'am, for your time. Is the so-called New Deal a genuine desire by the EU to better engage with Africa, or is it to counter China?
I think the New Deal, a kind of reimagining of the EU-Africa relationship, it definitely has been presented this way by the EU. We've heard Macron talking about the need to reinvent the EU-Africa relationship. And also, it has also been presented as a response to the Chinese engagement in Africa, which has been seen to have been rising over the last 2 decades. And no doubt that that is absolutely true. At the same time, the problem with the narrative is that it really encourages a very limited way of thinking about the European opportunities for engagement with African countries. It also means that Europeans are looking more at what China's doing rather than what are African countries actually demanding and what do they need for development. What does Agenda 2063 look like, for example, and then thinking about how do they best input into that.
Hannah, what more can both parties do with the African Continental Free Trade Area to make bilateral trade fairer and bigger?
The challenge with the AFCFTA is that the European Union has all these economic partnership arrangements. It's got some of the African countries also have preferential agreements, and the AFCFTA is continent-wide. We now have 41 countries who have ratified, taken the whole AFCFTA process into their parliaments and are really getting ready to be moving with it. It's operational. The rules of origin have been agreed for the majority of the products, goods. So the big question for the EU is, how does the EU change its approach, move away from a bilateral approach to a cross-continental approach? The European Union has signaled that it wants to try to link better to the AFCFTA, but ultimately something like a kind of, for example, a continent-wide preferential trade arrangement would be preferable to what the EU currently has at the moment. But again, African leaders really need to put these sorts of things onto the table. They really need to articulate what they want to see.
Hannah, good to have you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to join you today.
Thank you. Now, with the coming online of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, Addis Ababa will be generating excess power. And a deal has been agreed to export some 400 megawatts every year to Nairobi.
Ethiopia has completed the construction of more than 80% of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam on the Nile and is seeking to produce 700 megawatts as part of the pilot phase. Addis Ababa had hoped to begin generating electricity from the dam last October. Last year, Ethiopia announced the completion of the second filling of the dam's reservoir, prompting protests from Sudan and Egypt. Switching on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam will move Ethiopia's power production capacity to over 5,500 megawatts. The country is looking for consumers of its excess capacity. A statement by Addis Ababa's foreign ministry said the deal had been reached to sell electricity to Nairobi. The agreement, worth $1.3 billion, will see Kenya import 400 megawatts of power annually. The World Bank and the African Development Bank already committed funds to build over 1,000-kilometer-long transmission line. Kenya's energy demand has seen steady growth in recent years. The country generates slightly over 2,000 megawatts.
And that wraps up this episode of Business Africa. I am Ronald Kato. The news continues on air and online. Bye for now, and I'll see you on the next episode of Business Africa.